The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields as a warm breeze rustled through the corn stalks. Old man Harlan stood at the edge of his property, gazing out at the land he had toiled on for decades. Each furrow held memories sweet, hard-earned victories of planting and harvest, of laughter and loss. But today, a different tension lingered in the air, like the moment before a storm. Just a week ago, Harlan had received a letter, a single sheet filled with threats. The words echoed in his mind, unsettling but not unfamiliar. Over the years, whispers had floated through the nearby town like dark smoke. Greedy developers, shadowy figures in the night, had their eyes on his land, hungry for the lush soil and prime location. But Harlan wasn't one to give in. Not to anyone. Not even when trouble came knocking at his door. As dusk settled, he turned back toward the creaking farmhouse, the structure older than him, full of stories and secrets. The porch swayed gently, creaking like a warning, but Harlan paid no mind. He clasped a cold glass of iced tea, its refreshing chill momentarily soothing his nerves. With every slurp he felt grounded, defiantly alive. It was his land, and nothing would change that without a fight. That night, as darkness deepened, Harlan slipped into bed, the weight of the world heavy on his chest. He closed his eyes, but dreams of his crops and cattle turned into visions of dark figures encroaching on his peace. Shadows danced behind his eyelids, taunting him. When he woke, beads of sweat clung to his forehead, and he knew that the lurking danger was no longer just a figment of his imagination. The next morning, he decided to take a walk. He needed the fresh air, the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. As he strolled down the gravel road that bordered his vast fields, Harlan spotted them, a group of men loitering at the edge of his property. They wore dark jackets and had hands tucked deep in their pockets, their faces obscured. His heart raced. Instinct kicked in. They were not here for a friendly chat. Harlan called out, his voice steady. The men turned, revealing hardened expressions that could easily shatter glass. Silence enveloped them like a thick fog. One stepped forward, a grim smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Just here to talk, farmer, about your land." With each word, tension thickened. Harlan straightened his back. "My land is not for sale. Not now, not ever," he replied, defiance coursing through him like electricity. The man's grin faded, replaced by steely resolve. "You're making a mistake, old man." Harlan's heart thundered in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He pushed his chin up, every bit the stubborn farmer he was raised to be. That evening, foreboding hung over the farm. Harlan knew that pushing back would only ignite their wrath, yet surrendering wasn't an option. He grabbed a pen and paper, laying out his thoughts. Who were these men? Why would they stop at nothing to take what was his? Days turned into a blur, mornings spent tilling the fields, evenings waiting for knocks on the door that never came. But the air around him felt charged, primed for confrontation, like a coiled snake ready to strike. Then, a week later, it happened. Late at night, a sharp rattle at the door jolted him from sleep. Heart pounding, he grabbed the shotgun from beneath his bed, the familiar weight calming him. Peering through the window's grimy glass, he saw them, two silhouettes. They whispered in hushed tones, eyes glinting under the moonlight like predators. Harlan held his breath, gripping the weapon tighter. Summoning courage, he threw open the door, standing tall. His voice rang out raw and fierce. "Just a little chat," one of them hissed, stepping into the light. "You are being very stubborn, Harlan." The words dripped with menace, heavy with unspoken threats. Harlan felt his heart race. Every instinct screamed at him to back down, but backing down felt like relinquishing a part of himself. "I said I'm not selling," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear quivering in his chest. The men exchanged glances. The tension crackled, the unspoken language of confrontation passing between them. The second man challenged, stepping closer. Before he knew it, they lunged forward. Harlan's instincts kicked in. He swung the shotgun, catching the first man off guard. He stumbled back, his bravado evaporating as pain etched itself onto his face. The second man halted, eyes wide, realizing how far they had crossed. "Get out," Harlan growled, adrenaline surging through his veins. The threat hung in the air, palpable, heavy with risk. The men slowly retreated, the fiery spirit of the old farmer scalding them more than any weapon could. Harlan slammed the door shut, heart hammering against his chest. pulse racing through every fiber of his being. It was one battle won, but the war felt far from over. Word spread quickly through the town about the confrontation. Many residents knew Harlan as the stubborn old farmer, a man who wore his grit proudly like a well-loved burden. But now they whispered with concern, watching as shadows lingered around the edges of his property. Would he really stand firm against those who would strip him of everything? Their questions echoed in Harlan's mind, mingling with the sounds of the creeping night. Days turned into weeks. Each morning he rose and ventured into the fields, sweat glistening on his brow, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. But every night he felt it, the ire creeping back, knowing that the fight was far from over. Then one fateful evening, the headlights of a truck pierced the darkness as it rolled into his driveway, tires crunching over gravel. Harlan's stomach twisted. He watched from the window, heart pounding against his ribs. 3 men stepped out, and he could see it in their demeanor they were done playing games. He grabbed his shotgun again, determination coursing through him. As they approached the house, the weight of their intentions pressed down on him like rain before a storm. Harlan stepped outside, a titan against the night, ready to defend what was rightfully his. He shouted, aiming the weapon at the ground in front of them. "Stop this, old man," the first one barked. Harlan shook his head. "You think I'll just roll over? This land is my life." Laughter. It was mocking, cruel, and it rippled like a wave, washing over the private battleground they'd created. The threat lingered in the air as Harlan's pulse raced. Each word was a hammer against the walls of his resolve. His chest tightened, mind racing. He had fought through storms and droughts, through grief and joy. He was not about to let this battle break him. And then it happened. One man lunged, and in a split second, Harlan pulled the trigger. The unforgiving sound echoed through the valley, a thunderous roar. But instead of a body hitting the ground, the man leapt back stumbling, fear flooding his gaze. The incredulity painted on their faces fueled Harlan. He stood taller, commanded the ground he had stood on all his life. It was a standoff. Harlan's heart hammered as he held them at bay. "You don't want to test me." What happened next was unimaginable. The men exchanged shark-like glances before retreating, hearts pounding, pride swallowed by fear. They clambered back into their truck and sped off, tires screeching against gravel, leaving Harlan standing completely still, heart racing and breath hanging in the crisp night air. He had won. But victory tasted bittersweet, a mixed bag of relief and unease. Inside, he felt shaken, ready to collapse, yet triumph stitched through the seams of his being. It was not just his land, it was his spirit, his courage, his very essence that had prevailed. The sun rose the next morning, golden and bright, and for the first time in weeks, Harlan felt the warmth. He stepped outside and stretched, inhaling the earthy scent of his fields. The shadows that had plagued him seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of rustling corn and the gentle whisper of the wind. Yet deep down, he knew the threat wasn't truly gone. Fear had a way of lurking around the edges, waiting for a moment to seep back in. But Harlan was ready. He would stand firm against anything that threatened his land, his home, and his way of life. Standing at the edge of his property, he felt a surge of gratitude for the soil beneath his feet and the sky above. He had fought for every inch of this land, and it was his invincible, untamed, and fiercely alive. No amount of intimidation could shake his resolve. Harlan was not just a farmer. He was a guardian of his legacy, a testament to the power of unwavering spirit. And as the day unfolded before him, he vowed to remain vigilant, to defend not just the land but also the very essence of who he was. Because in the face of all threats, the heart of a farmer beats boldly unbroken, unyielding and proud. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the small patch of earth that old man Harlan had called home for more than 30 years. The air held a sense of foreboding as heavy clouds rolled in, blocking the last of the fading light. Harlan stood at the edge of his fields, a worn straw hat shielding his weathered face, and surveyed the rows of corn swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was peaceful until it wasn't. "Mister," a voice broke the stillness, sharp and sudden. Harlan turned to see a figure approaching, a young man dressed sharply in a dark suit. The contrast of his formal attire against the untamed farmland made Harlan's hands clench into fists. He knew all too well that suits like that brought trouble. They were like shadows that stalked you long after the sun set. "I'm here to discuss your property," the man said, his demeanor cool and calculated. Harlan squinted, trying to read the man's intentions. "There's nothing to discuss," he replied, his voice steady. The young man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't quite understand, do you?" With a subtle energy, Harlan straightened, his chest puffing out defiantly. "I have worked this land my whole life." The man stepped closer, his tone shifting, gaining an edge. "People like you need to know when to let go. You're outnumbered in this world." An insidious chill crept down Harlan's spine, but he pushed it aside. He was no stranger to intimidation. "You think you can scare me?" "Think about it, old-timer," the young man warned, stepping back just enough to maintain eye contact. "You'll have your days to enjoy if you just step aside. Otherwise, we'll make things." And just like that, he turned on his heel, striding back toward the car waiting at the end of the lane. Harlan mulled over the encounter, the weight of the world settling like an anchor in his gut. He could sense the storm brewing, not just in the skies overhead, but in the human hearts that craved what he had: a piece of land, sacred and irreplaceable. That night, as the wind howled outside, he lay awake, tossing and turning, unable to shake the unease gnawing at him. He felt vulnerable, exposed. This wasn't the first time someone had set their sights on his property. Just a few months earlier, whispers of developers had slithered through town, and now it seemed the whispers had grown into a cacophony of threats. Days turned into weeks, and Harlan continued to work his fields. He plowed through the dirt, planting seeds with the fervor of a man determined to protect not just his crops but his history, his legacy. But as he toiled, the young man and his associates began to haunt Harlan's thoughts. Car doors slammed in the distance like a drum roll announcing danger. Shadows shifted where they didn't belong, and Harlan felt those eyes upon him, judging, assessing. Then one fateful evening, the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires shattered the evening calm. Harlan stepped out of the barn, the fading rays of the sun illuminating his rugged features. This time, a black truck parked menacingly in his yard, its windows tinted so dark that not even the hint of brazen light could penetrate. The driver's door swung open, and two men clad in leather jackets exited the vehicle. They approached, their presence exuding a sense of authority that chilled Harlan to the bone. "We're here to talk," said one of them, a scar crossing his brow like a brand. "No discussions," Harlan replied, planting his feet firmly on the ground. Their laughter echoed around him, full of menace. "You really think you can hold onto this land? We've got plans, old man." Harlan's heart raced, the shadows of the evening clutching at him. "This land is my life." The second man leaned in, his eyes darkened with barely contained malice. In that moment, Harlan felt a primal instinct awakening within him. He was no longer just a man. He was a warrior defending his homeland, a guardian of what he cherished most. "If you want this land, you'll have to drag me out of here," he said, voice thunderous. Without warning, the men advanced, each footstep heavy with purpose. Harlan's instincts screamed at him to flee, yet he refused to move. He stood his ground, clutching a rusted pitchfork from the barn, its wooden handle familiar and comforting. If this was going to be a fight, he would give them one worth remembering. And just like that, a violent struggle erupted. Harlan swung the pitchfork with every ounce of strength he could muster, pushing back against the two who stumbled but didn't fall. They were relentless. Adrenaline surged in exchange for fear as Harlan fought against overwhelming odds. Sharp objects and crude tools became allies in his defense, a dance of desperation and survival. With a swift thrust, he managed to catch one man off guard, sending him crashing to the ground. But the second man caught him from behind, grabbing his arm. Pain shot through Harlan, but he spun, breaking free and landing a fierce blow. In those chaotic moments, it felt like time stood still, the old farmer against two wolves fighting for his life. But then the realization tore through him like a winter's chill. He was just one man, growing older with each passing moment. Just as he was ready to make his last stand, headlights appeared on the gravel road. A car rushed towards them, tires screeching against the earth. The men retreated momentarily, glancing at their approaching doom, uncertainty etched on their faces like a deep crack in porcelain. With a final surge, Harlan shouted, "Leave this land." The headlights swept across the yard, illuminating the scene of chaos. Harlan's heart pounded, his chest tight with tension. It felt like the standoff in one of those old westerns, where only one side could emerge victorious. And just like that, the two men turned on their heels, scrambling back to their truck. Wasting no time, they sped away, a cloud of dust swirling in their wake. Harlan stood there, breathless, shaking as the adrenaline subsided, leaving exhaustion in its place. But he wasn't done yet. He made his way inside, bolting the doors as the darkness enveloped him. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Rest was a luxury he could no longer afford. The following days morphed into a nightmare. Harlan could feel the weight of their threats like a storm cloud hovering overhead. Rumors swirled through town, each person whispering of what had transpired. He became a figure of pity, a relic of old times, thought of as an unyielding statue against the forces of modernity. But what they didn't see was the fire burning inside of him. Without rest, he fortified his defenses. He learned about the men who sought his land, tracking their movements like a hawk observing its prey. He collected evidence of their threats, photographs of the truck outside of his farm. Weeks passed. Each day blended into the next, filled with sweat-soaked labor and a growing sense of foreboding. He knew they would come back. The question was when and how. Harlan devised a plan. He would not be just a victim in their game. He would take the fight to them. In the quiet hours of the night, he began gathering his findings. Harlan noticed one of the named leaders, Marco, known for his ruthless demeanor, often visited nearby bars. Realizing that this was a chance to confront the enemy in their lair, he slipped into the shadow of night and made his way into town. The bar pulsed with life, laughter and music cloaking the sinister undertones of the people within. Harlan's heart thudded heavily in his chest as he scanned the familiar faces, each one illuminated by hazy lights. He spotted Marco at the far end of the bar, surrounded by a group of raucous friends. Taking a breath, Harlan approached, his resolve hardening with each step. He called out, forcing the name to break through the din of conversation. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing with recognition. The laughter faded, heads turning as his gang fixed eyes on the intruder. Marco sneered, irritation thin beneath his bravado. Harlan stepped forward, fear transforming into fire. "I'm here to warn you, I won't stand by while you threaten my land." The bar fell silent, tension hanging in the air like a taut string ready to snap. Marco leaned back, an amused smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "Look at you." Harlan took a breath, steadying his resolve. "This isn't just a farm to me. It's my home, my life. You want to take that from me?" Marco's voice dripped with mockery, but something in his eyes darkened. The bravado that dripped from the young man wore thin in the presence of Harlan's unwavering gaze. "Consider it a warning," Harlan replied, his voice low but clear. "I'm not giving up without a fight." With that, Harlan turned, leaving the bar behind him. The heat of confrontation burned in his chest, but in that moment he felt empowered, alive. He knew what he was fighting for, and it was no longer just about the land. It was about dignity, pride, and the belief that one man could stand against the tides of greed and ambition. Days turned into weeks once more, but something shifted. Marco's gang grew wary of their pursuit. They became shadows that skittered out of reach, fleeting phantoms of an aggressive past. Rumors swirled again, but they turned from threats into whispers of caution. Harlan continued his daily routines, doing what he loved most. He cultivated the soil, tended to his crops, and watched every sunrise with unwavering dedication. He had stood strong against their storms, and in the heart of it all, he found clarity, a sense of purpose that transcended his circumstances. Then one crisp morning, he stood at the edge of his property, gazing out at the fields that stretched endlessly before him. There was a newfound calmness, an aura of peace that settled like a blanket over him. Jitters of doubt faded away, replaced by the indomitable spirit that had shaped him. But the storm would come. It always did. As if on cue, a truck appeared at the end of the lane, moving slowly. Harlan felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. He squared his shoulders, heart thumping as the vehicle rolled to a stop. Out stepped the familiar figure of Marco, this time flanked by a larger crew. The sun glinted ominously off their backs, shadows stretching long as they approached him, a pack ready to claim their prey. Marco called out, a smirk on his lips. Harlan stood firm, raising a hand as if to stop them. "You should have stayed away," he warned, the confidence in his voice glaringly evident to both them and himself. "That's cute," Marco replied, stepping closer, eyes narrowing like a snake ready to strike. "I'm not interested in your business. I'm only interested in my land." The air hummed with tension, each breath an electric charge crackling through the space between them. The sun beat down like judgment as sweat dripped down Harlan's brow. Then, without a moment's notice, a member of Marco's crew lunged forward to strike. But in that instant, Harlan thrust his arm out in protest. The pitchfork he had kept close for years sprang up as if guided by destiny itself, catching the man off guard, sending him sprawling backward. Harlan roared, brandishing the pitchfork with the fury of a long-awaited storm. A chorus of jeers erupted behind Marco, but the man stood rooted, surprise etched into his features. For the first time, doubt flickered across Marco's expression, as if pondering whether to press further. But Harlan wasn't merely a farmer anymore. He had become a bastion of resistance, a symbol of defiance. "Leave and never come back," he yelled, voice booming with authority, and just like that something shifted in the air. The gang hesitated, glancing at one another as if weighing the depth of their next step. Harlan stood tall, unwilling to break. He felt every heartbeat, the weight of lives past, present, and future pulsing through him. Then Marco snarled, a quick decision ripping through him. He shouted, motioning for his crew to retreat. With that, they scrambled back to their vehicle, the vibe shifting rapidly from attack to defeat. As the truck screeched away, Harlan felt the tension ease, every inch of him returning to the calm he sought for so long. In the silence that followed, the weight of dread lifted. It was no longer a battle for land. It had become a fight for legacy, pride, and hope. Harlan could feel it, the very essence of who he was woven through the fabric of the land, stronger than any threat that dared approach. Days turned into weeks, the panic whispering into mere legend as Harlan continued to work his fields, dreams stretching far beyond the horizon. He tended to the sweetness of the fruits of his labor, a testament to resilience and refusal to yield in the face of adversity. As the seasons shifted, so did the whispers. The townsfolk began to admire Harlan, not as a relic, but as a warrior, a man who stood strong when the tides sought to take him under. They spoke of him in hushed tones, recounting how he overcame danger with the gritty determination of a hero from the stories of old. Through it all, Harlan smiled, knowing that the battle wasn't just a chapter in his life. It had woven him into the community in a way he never anticipated. His land flourished, repelling the darkness that had once threatened to encroach upon it. And so, as the years rolled on, Harlan remained steadfast, a guardian of what he cherished most. No matter the threats that came knocking, the fire within him was unwavering, an eternal flame in a world that dared to test his spirit. With each sunrise, he continued to remind himself that while land can be taken, the heart that defends it, an indomitable spirit that refuses to yield, will stand unbreakable in the face of any storm. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Harlan White heard the engine roar. He squinted out of the kitchen window, gripping his coffee mug tightly as the sound of gravel crunching under tires penetrated the early morning stillness. There it was again, a black pickup truck winding its way up his long gravel driveway. Harlan muttered under his breath, instincts flaring. He leaned closer to the window, and as the truck's shadow stretched across his porch, a sense of dread washed over him. He knew this truck. He had seen it a few times before, never with good intentions. He put down his coffee and walked to the door, the wood creaking beneath his worn boots. The latch clicked as he swung the door open, its familiar sound contrasting with the unfamiliar energy that electrified the air. 3 men climbed out of the truck, tall and rugged, the kind of men who looked like they were used to getting what they wanted and weren't afraid to intimidate anyone who stood in their way. "Mister," the man in front called out, an unnerving smile spreading across his face. "I don't recall inviting you over," Harlan said, defiance simmering in his voice. "Let's skip the pleasantries. We're here about your land," the man said, confidence radiating from him. Harlan's stomach tightened. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to pry his beloved farm away from him, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Fair. Fair for who? Not for me, Harlan shot back, anger rising. He knew they wanted to buy him out, but he wasn't selling. Not now, not ever. The man's expression hardened. You really think you can just stand in our way? Money won't buy the memories I've made on this land, Harlan replied, fists clenched at his sides. The man glanced back at his companions, a glimmer of amusement flickering in his eyes. Well, Harlan, if you think we're going to walk away, you've got another thing coming. The tension in the air thickened, swirling like the dust kicked up by their tires. Harlan could feel the weight of the threat behind their words, but he refused to let fear take hold. He straightened his back, heart pounding but resolute. I'll not be intimidated. The man chuckled, but it was cold, devoid of warmth. As they climbed into the truck, Harlan felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his chest, but he refused to give in to it. He watched them drive away, the dust settling like a ghost over his land, and promised himself he wouldn't let them take his home from him. Days turned into weeks, and the men became a consistent presence, circling like vultures. Each time the truck pulled into his driveway, dread clenched Harlan's gut tighter. He spent his nights peering out the window, vigilant as shadows flickered across his fields. He could almost feel the heaviness of their threat hanging in the air like thick fog. Then came a night that etched itself into his memory forever. It was late, and the moon bathed his land in silver light when he heard it, a low rumble echoing in the distance. Harlan's heart dropped. He grabbed the shotgun he kept propped against his bedroom wall and quietly crept towards the front door. As he stepped outside, the air felt charged, alive. He spotted their truck parked at the edge of his property, engines revving like a predator stalking its prey. His grip tightened around the shotgun as adrenaline flooded his veins. This wasn't just a warning anymore, this was a direct threat. "Hey, old man," someone shouted, their voice booming in the night. Harlan stayed low, peering out from behind the barn, his heart racing. He yelled back, trying to sound tougher than he felt. "We just want to discuss your options," the man said, swaggering forward. "You know it's only a matter of time before this land belongs to us anyway." Harlan shot back, firing up his courage. He lifted the shotgun, aiming it toward the group, his hands shaking but steady. Silence fell momentarily, their cocky grins faltering. But then the leader chuckled as if Harlan's threat was an amusing joke. "This is all just a game to you, huh?" Suddenly, the calm of the night shattered. The men rushed him, shouting and attacking as one. Harlan pulled the trigger without thinking, his body reacting before his mind could comprehend the noise. The sound of the gun was deafening, ricocheting off the trees and echoing back at him. He caught a glimpse of the men stumbling back in shock, not expecting a fight, not expecting the old farmer to have any fight left in him. Harlan's heart pounded in his chest like a war drum, and instinct took over. He swung his shotgun around, keeping his footing firm, braced for whatever would come next. But confusion spread across their faces, and they turned to retreat, stumbling back to their truck, wide-eyed. Harlan shouted, his voice booming like thunder in the silence that followed. With that, they sped off, tires screeching against gravel. Harlan stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his decision crashing down on him as adrenaline faded. He tried to catch his breath, the reality of what just happened settling like stone in his gut. He knew they wouldn't give up easily. This was just the beginning. The following days were a blur of heightened tension and vigilance. Harlan had become a determined soldier defending his territory, ready for whatever came next. He fortified his farm with piles of firewood and old farm equipment as makeshift barricades, while also stockpiling supplies he hoped would never be needed. The shadows of the men no longer haunted his dreams. Instead, they fueled his anger and resolve, driving him to protect his sacred land at all costs. Then a month later comes the call that changed everything. Harlan was working in the field, sweat dripping down his back when the sheriff's truck pulled up, lights flashing. His heart sank. He wiped his brow and made his way over, nerves fraying at the edges. "Harlan," the sheriff said with a heavy sigh, stepping out of his vehicle. "I need to talk to you." Harlan asked, dread pooling in his stomach. The sheriff glanced around as if searching for the right words to soften the blow. "They've been making threats, Harlan." "Real threats?" Harlan felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean?" Yeah, but that was just a temporary retreat. They're not done. A sinking feeling settled heavy in Harlan's gut. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, frustration showing clear. For now, just stay vigilant. There's not much we can do without proof or something more concrete, but keep your shotgun close. With that warning echoing in his ears, Harlan returned to his work, thoughts racing. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. He was fighting not just for his land, but for something much bigger: his legacy, his dignity. Days morphed into weeks again, and the uncertainty clawed at Harlan, an itch he couldn't reach. The sun blazed high in the sky one afternoon, and as he took a breather, he heard a familiar rumble in the distance. Panic churning in his chest, he dropped his tools and rushed toward the house. The silhouettes of the men from the truck emerged once more, but this time there were more of them, 7 in total, their shadows stretching across the yard as they advanced like hunters closing in on their prey. Harlan's heart raced. He couldn't back down, but he felt the weight of their overwhelming numbers. He shouted, hoping his voice didn't betray the fear swirling inside him. "We're not playing games anymore, Harlan," their leader said, eyes glinting with malice. "We want to make this easy for you. Just hand over the land and nobody gets hurt." "I will never give up my land," Harlan said firmly, each word adding layers to his strength. Laughter erupted among the group, cruel and mocking. "You think you're tough? Tough doesn't cut it in this world." Suddenly, they lunged at him and the world exploded into chaos. Harlan reached for his shotgun, heavy, cold, familiar against his skin. He pulled the trigger again, but this time it was a different kind of fire, fueled not just by instinct but by desperation. The men froze momentarily, the thunderous sound causing them to stagger. Harlan felt the heat of adrenaline fuel his courage. He roared, planting his feet firmly like a rooted tree, but they didn't back down. They charged, and in a split second he knew it would be a fight for his life. One man swung at him, while another tried to tackle him to the ground. Harlan ducked, punching back relentlessly, keeping the shotgun close. A flurry of blows exchanged, each moment a blur of primal instinct and fear. He struck and kicked, fighting for everything that mattered to him, pouring every ounce of strength into every movement. But the odds were stacked against him, and as more men advanced, fatigue threatened to pull him under. Just when it seemed they would overwhelm him, the sheriff's car came screeching down the driveway. The screech of tires felt like a blessing from above as sirens blared and lights flashed brightly. The sheriff yelled, jumping out of his vehicle with a gun drawn. The men momentarily froze, confusion tightening their faces. In that brief moment, Harlan channeled all his remaining energy and charged forward, pushing back against the tide, forcing them away from his land. The sheriff moved swiftly, taking control of the situation, shouting commands that cut through the chaos. "Step back." One by one, the men turned to flee, scrambling back to their truck, the dream of distilling fear and seizing control slipping through their fingers. Harlan, gasping for breath, felt a surge of elation mixed with exhaustion. They were finally leaving. As the dust settled and the echo of shattering glass faded, Harlan stood tall beside the sheriff, springing back to life like a wildfire ignited. "You need to build a case against those men." "I will, Harlan. They've crossed the line, and I'll make sure they know what it means to tangle with the wrong man," the sheriff promised, patting Harlan on the back. But deep down, Harlan knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The men would return, he could feel it in his bones. Days turned into months, and the threat of those men lingered like the humid summer air clinging to his skin. Yet Harlan held firm, fortified by determination and a newfound sense of power. He met with the sheriff frequently, gathering evidence, documenting their threats, and preparing for the fight to come. Finally, after weeks of building his case, the moment arrived. Harlan stood before a small gathering of concerned townsfolk, the sheriff by his side, laying out the evidence. Recordings of their threats, photos of their harassment, everything meticulously pieced together. "I'm not just fighting for my land, I'm fighting for all of us," Harlan spoke passionately, his voice steady. The room buzzed with energy as he made his case, and for the first time, faith sparked among the townsfolk, uniting them against the threats Harlan had faced alone for so long. They rallied behind him, determined to protect their community, their homes, their identities. Weeks later, news broke that law enforcement had detained some of the men. Harlan felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew the battle for his land was far from over. It wasn't just about the farmers against a group of criminals. It was a fight against a world that valued profit over people's lives, a world that seemed to forget the heart behind the land. The seasons changed, and life continued. Harlan returned to the fields, planting seeds for the next harvest, but deep inside, he felt the threads of resilience tighten. He had faced danger, challenged fear, and refused to yield. With every sunset settling over his land, he knew the darkness would always try to creep back in. But he had learned something vital throughout this fight. The heart of a man willing to stand for what he believes in can never truly be broken. Harlan planted not just crops, but a legacy, a lasting testament to fighting for one's home, refusing to yield in the face of adversity, and embracing the spirit of community that they had forged together. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with warm hues of orange and pink, Harlan stepped outside, feeling the weight of the world shift off his shoulders. He raised his gaze towards the open sky, and for the first time in a long time, let out a deep breath of relief. His land was not just dirt and crops, it was a living, breathing embodiment of his will. And no matter what came knocking at his door, he would stand tall, ever vigilant, demonstrating that the heart of a farmer is a force to be reckoned with. Long after the sun set, the spirit of resilience would forever shine brightly within him, unyielding against the darkness of the world. The old farmhouse sat like a sentinel on the edge of the vast fields, the sun rising behind it, casting long shadows over the land. Harlan White had poured his soul into this parcel of earth, working it by hand for over 30 years. But on that morning dawn, breaking pink and golden over the horizon, an unsettling frequency rattled his bones. The crunch of gravel lurked in the distance, drawing closer. Harlan wiped his brow and squinted through the porch railing. The black truck that rolled up his driveway wasn't any ordinary vehicle. It was dark, menacing, and filled with the kind of men who knew how to take what they wanted. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach tight. This wasn't the first time they had come, but every visit seemed more threatening than the last. The driver called out, his voice booming across the yard. Harlan stepped forward, fortifying his resolve with each stride. "There's nothing to talk about." "This land isn't for sale," he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in his gut. They laughed, a sound that sent chills racing up his spine. "You're just a stubborn farmer. It'd be a shame if something happened to this place," one of them sneered, gesturing to the sprawling fields as if it were a playground. "Threatening me won't work," Harlan shot back. The man's smile turned serrated. "You may think you're tough, but we want this land." "Then you'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands," Harlan challenged, feeling palpable energy shift as their menacing smiles faded. With a flourish, Harlan turned and went back into his house, a coordinate battle plan forming in his mind. He had fought this fight before. Today wouldn't be any different. Days blurred into nights as Harlan fortified his defenses, locked his doors, and kept a watchful eye on the horizon. The threat wasn't just local, it was systemic, a never-ending struggle against a world that prioritized profit over people. Then, one evening, tension hung in the air like heavy fog. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, there was a sudden knock at the door, a sharp, urgent rap that sent Harlan's heart racing. This wasn't just another visit, it felt personal. He grabbed the old shotgun, the familiar weight grounding him as he approached the door. He barked, swinging it open to reveal two of the men, their faces twisted with contempt. "We're tired of your games, Harlan," one grunted. "You're making this too difficult." Harlan scoffed. As their eyes darted like predators sizing up their prey, Harlan felt a surge of courage. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a guardian of his heritage. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. "You'll have to do better than talking tough," he said, leveling the shotgun toward the ground. For a heartbeat, the tension hung heavy between them, fraught with unspoken threats. Then, with a quick turn, they retreated to their truck, slamming the doors before peeling away in a cloud of dust. In that moment, Harlan felt a mix of relief and unease. This battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. He turned and locked the door, heart pounding, steeling himself for the fight that lay ahead. In the days that followed, the nights turned restless. Harlan laid awake in bed, listening for the sound of car engines and flashes of headlights cutting through the dark. The land was more than soil and crops. It was his home, woven with the memories of laughter, loss, and labor. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. Whispers of the men's actions rippled through the town like wildfire. People who used to wave at him from their porches now looked away, unsure whether to engage with the man who was now at the center of an unseen war. One afternoon, Harlan stepped into town to pick up supplies. Tension filled the air like static electricity. In the local diner, the chatter hushed, all eyes landing on him. They murmured in hushed tones, a mix of concern and fear casting long shadows over the warmth that once filled those walls. An old-timer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a few unwanted visitors," Harlan replied, forcing a smile, hiding the sting of isolation creeping in. But in truth, the fear gnawed at him like a dog on a bone. That night, defiance pulsed through him. He began plotting a course of action. He would not go down without a fight. He spent hours going over his options, collecting evidence of every threatening encounter he endured. He even began to learn how to tape record phone calls, snapping photos of the men when they lurked near his fields. Each piece of documentation was a brick in the wall of defense he aimed to construct. Harlan would make sure they would have no choice but to back off. Then came a night he would never forget. Harlan lay in bed, eyes closed but sleep eluding him, when the sound of that familiar truck rumbled down his driveway. He could feel the muscles in his shoulders tighten, instinct warning him. Grabbing his shotgun, he slipped quietly out of bed, tiptoeing to the window. The men were out of their truck, gathering by the fence like wolves stalking their prey. Harlan's heart raced. This was it. Gathering the courage he had honed through years of hard labor, he stepped outside. He shouted, the weight of his words cutting through the night air like a blade. Chilled laughter echoed back at him. "What's wrong, old man?" Harlan demanded, fury igniting in his veins. With sudden violence, one of them lunged forward and instincts kicked in. Harlan leveled his shotgun, pulling the trigger without hesitation. The sound reverberated through the air, but the shot went wild, echoing off the trees. One of them yelled, and they scrambled back to their truck, panic melting their bravado as they sped off into the night, dust trailing behind. Harlan stood alone, breathless, adrenaline pumping through him as he choked down a sense of fear. His mind raced. What had just happened? He had struck a blow, yes, but at what cost? The days that followed were a blur of anxiety, tension mounting between him and the looming threat. Harlan felt both triumphant and terrified. As the sun rose each morning, he kept returning to the fields, finding solace in the rhythm of labor, planting seeds and tending crops. But beneath that calm exterior, he sensed the storm clouds gathering. The men would come back. They always did. One afternoon, as Harlan worked the fields, a car rolled slowly by. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he looked up to see the truck pulling up his driveway once more, this time with more men, each of them large and intimidating. Harlan yelled at the fields as he dashed toward his farmhouse, breath hitching in his throat. They emerged like shadows, closing in on him with their menacing presence. "We're here to finish what we started," the leader snarled, taking a step forward. The others flanked him, forming a wall of intimidation. "Not on my watch," Harlan retorted, his steadfast spirit flaring alive. He reached for his shotgun, heart racing as he held it in front of him, bolstered by courage. "Back off or I'll..." Before he could finish, the leader lunged at him, fists swinging. Harlan tightened his grip and fired a warning shot, aiming high. The sound echoed through the air, sending a shockwave of fear through the assailants. Harlan yelled, adrenaline fueling his resolve as he faced them down, the farmhouse behind him standing as a silent witness to his fight. The men hesitated, backs pressed against the truck, indecision flickering in their eyes. For now, Harlan had the upper hand, and he wasn't about to let them walk all over him. With a frustrated growl, the leader turned, signaling for the others to retreat. He shouted as they scrambled back into their truck, slamming the doors behind them. Their tires squealed against the gravel as they left, and Harlan felt a rush of triumph bubble within him. But doubt crept in as the evening sun sank low, shadows elongating across his land. The next day, Harlan knew he had to up the ante. He called on the sheriff, laying out everything that had happened, the confrontations, the threats, the terror. The sheriff listened, concern creasing his brow. "Harlan, we have to act. If they're this bold, they'll come back. I can't promise anything without evidence." Broken pieces fell into place and Harlan felt resolve wash over him. He would end this. He gathered up every scrap of evidence he had collected, forged Polaroids in hand, hands shaking with the gravity of his task. This time, when the men returned, which he knew the police would be there alongside him, he would not be defenseless any longer. Weeks passed, and at long last the moment came. It was an overcast day, thick clouds looming overhead as though the universe was preparing for his confrontation. Harlan stood alongside the sheriff, the weight of the evidence burdening his shoulders but igniting a fire in his spirit. As the familiar engine roared down the driveway, Harlan's heart raced. He had help now. He wasn't alone in this fight. The sheriff's car pulled up right next to him, lights flashing as the men stepped out, cocky grins slowly fading when they saw the law standing with Harlan. Harlan shouted, feeling the surge of adrenaline fuel his courage, the shotgun resting firmly at his side. One said, glancing between Harlan and the sheriff, confusion etching lines in his forehead. "You know what this is about." Harlan countered. The sheriff stepped forward. "You're not welcome here." The men exchanged glances and panic flickered in their eyes. Their leader spat, spitting disdain onto the gravel as he backed away. "Maybe it is," Harlan said, feeling righteous anger bubbling over. As they retreated, Harlan felt energy surge through him, exhilaration mingled with fear and pride. This was a victory worth celebrating, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been pushed around, anyone who had ever felt helpless in the face of threats. In the following days, news spread through the town, whispers of bravado turning into stories of resilience. Harlan became a local hero, not for his strength, but for his resolve to stand against the threats and intimidation. People stopped by to shake his hand, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. And as the sun set over the fields that he had fought so hard to protect, Harlan realized the truth. Victory did not just lie in winning a battle, but in the spirit of a community that rallied together. His land was safe once more, but more importantly, he had woven an unbreakable bond with his neighbors, a shared understanding of the struggle for existence, the refusal to yield against those who sought to take away what truly belonged to them. The seasons would change, challenges would arise, and the memories of those men would fade. But Harlan would remain rooted, the heart of a farmer living on a defiant spirit that had weathered the storms and emerged victorious. And as he looked out over the horizon, golden fields glistening under the sun, he understood that the fight was never truly over. But for today, he had claimed victory, and with it, the unyielding spirit of a man who refused to back down. The first ray of sunlight broke through the dense treetops, illuminating the fields like a golden quilt spread across the landscape. Harlan White had spent a lifetime laboring on this land, shaping every inch with sweat and determination. But even at dawn's embrace, an unsettling tension filled the air. A rumble in the distance disrupted the morning calm, cutting through the peaceful chirps of birds. Harlan squinted, recognizing the black pickup truck that pulled into his driveway. It wasn't just any truck, it was the harbinger of trouble, a sign that things were about to get ugly. "Not again," he muttered, his heart sinking as three familiar figures climbed out. The men were rough around the edges, their intentions cloaked in a thin veneer of charm. But Harlan knew better. He had dealt with them before, and their interest in his land was anything but benign. "Morning, mister," the leader greeted, an exaggerated grin plastered across his face. Harlan crossed his arms, determination settling like a rock in his chest. "I don't want to chat." The grin faltered for a moment, annoyance flashing in the man's eyes. "You really think you can hold on to it? This land is prime, ripe for development." Harlan could feel the weight of their threat hanging in the air. He stood firm, remembering every early morning and late night he had poured into this place, his sanctuary where his children had laughed and grown. "You wouldn't understand." The men exchanged glances, amusement flickering on their faces. "Oh, we understand, but we also understand that you're stubborn." A chill crept down Harlan's spine. He had fought his fair share of battles, but the shadows of intimidation loomed larger than ever. With a cruel chuckle, the leader glanced back at his companions. "We'll see about that." As they climbed back into the truck, Harlan felt a surge of anger overpowering the fear. He would not yield. They could threaten him, but he wouldn't back down, not when the stakes were so high. Over the next few weeks, Harlan found himself living in a state of constant vigilance. Each night felt like a prelude to war. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the telltale rumble of the truck or the sound of footsteps that would disrupt the quiet. The land that had once felt safe and welcoming now felt like a battlefield. Then one night it happened. The wind howled like a banshee, and the skies darkened, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Harlan jolted awake to the unmistakable sound of gravel crunching beneath tires. His heart raced as he crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. There they were, the men standing at the edge of his property, whispering amongst themselves in low, conspiratorial tones. They looked like predators, hungry for their next move. Grabbing the shotgun he kept propped behind the door, Harlan made a choice. It was time to confront the ghosts haunting his land. Stepped outside, the cold air wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. He called, voice strong and unwavering against the storm. One of the men looked up, disdain etched across his features. "Just wanted to have a little chat." "You've made your intentions clear. I'm not selling," Harlan shouted back. An unsettling smile stretched across the leader's face. "Stubborn as ever. It'd be a shame if something happened to you." With quick motion, the men advanced, moving to encircle him, but Harlan was ready. He leveled the shotgun, heart pounding in unison with the thunder above. The tension was palpable, thick enough to slice. For a moment time froze, each man locked in a test of will under the ink-black sky punctuated by flashes of lightning. Harlan felt the rush of adrenaline sharpening his focus. He was not just defending his land, he was defending his very existence. The leader stepped closer, eyes gleaming with something darker. "You're just a farmer, Harlan." And then, with a shout, the men lunged forward. Harlan pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation, the deafening sound of gunfire shattering the night. The closest man stumbled back, shock washing over his face, and for a heartbeat, confusion mixed with fear passed over the others. Harlan felt a fierce surge of empowerment. He shouted, pushing fear aside and embracing the fire that had blazed within him. The men retreated, scrambling back toward their truck, and Harlan's heart raced as victory washed over him. But as their taillights disappeared into the darkness, uncertainty gnawed at him. This wouldn't be the last he'd see of them. Confrontation would come again, and he needed a plan. Harlan spent days in preparation, fortifying his home and livelihood. He invested in cameras, ready to document every interaction and attack. He practiced with the shotgun, ensuring he was prepared for whatever came next. This was his life, his land. He refused to yield. Finally, news of what had transpired spread through the small town where Harlan had lived for decades. People whispered in hushed tones, some shaking their heads in pity, others casting wary glances his way. The threats had carved a line of fear through the community. One day, as Harlan sat in the local diner, nursing a cup of coffee, an old friend approached him. "You know, Harlan, these men are trouble." "I'm not backing down," Harlan replied, conviction burning in his words. His friend leaned closer, eyes serious. "But what if this escalates?" A heavy silence enveloped them. Harlan understood the worry. After all, he had family, children who depended on him. But there was an unyielding spirit within him that wouldn't let him turn away from the fight. As the weeks rolled on, the tension persisted, and the weight of the threat loomed larger. Harlan's nights became filled with restless dreams, visions of his land slipping from his grasp. The feeling of being cornered tickled his instincts. Then, one fateful evening, it happened again. Rain poured down as if the heavens had opened up, drenching everything in a thick, dark veil. Harlan was in his barn, working late, when the low rumble of a familiar engine disrupted the sound of the rain. He peered cautiously out the door. The truck had returned, and this time there were more men, at least 6 now, their postures menacing under the weight of the storm. His heart pounded like a drum as he braced himself. He could feel the primal surge of something rising within him. It was time to confront them again. With heavy steps, he stepped out into the rain, the downpour soaking through his shirt instantly. He bellowed, refusing to show fear. Just a friendly visit, the leader slurred, his voice heavy with bravado, and the men laughed, but the sound felt hollow. Harlan spat back, anger washing over him. There's nothing friendly about you lot. Call whoever you want, Harlan, you're going to regret this, said one of the men behind the leader, eyes glinting with malice. Harlan gripped the shotgun tighter, the weight of it grounding him. If you take one more step, I swear, the leader surged forward, fists raised as he lunged. Adrenaline rushed through Harlan as he fired another warning shot, this time aimed between the men's feet. The blast echoed, and they all froze, confusion suddenly shifting into panic. Harlan shouted, feeling the surge of bravery flood his veins, but the men hesitated only for a moment before launching toward him once more. Harlan braced himself but fought with the instinct born from desperation. The fight erupted into chaos. Blows and grunts mingled with the roaring rain. Harlan swung the shotgun, striking one man down, but he felt himself losing ground against their sheer numbers. Desperation coiled within him, but he refused to yield despite every ounce of doubt. Then, as the struggle continued, headlights flashed behind him, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. It was the sheriff, lights flashing against the downpour, sirens wailing as he barreled down the driveway. In that moment, a rush of relief cascaded over him. Harlan screamed to the intruders, voice booming. The men froze momentarily, and Harlan took a step forward, emboldened. He yelled, the combination of fear and fury taking shape in his words. The men glanced at one another, then bolted back toward their truck, deciding survival was the better option. Harlan watched as they scrambled, adrenaline still fueling his heartbeat as the sheriff pulled up beside him. The sheriff asked, heightening the tension as he jumped from his vehicle, gun drawn, eyes scanning the surroundings. I'm fine, Harlan gritted out, breathing heavily. The sheriff nodded, understanding. We need to gather evidence and put a stop to this. Hours later, a storm still raged, but the fight had shifted. The sheriff documented everything, photos, statements, while Harlan shared the details of each encounter that had led them to this point. Together, they were building a dam against the tide of intimidation. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to unfold. As more townsfolk learned of Harlan's plight, they came forward with their own stories, of their encounters with the men who had come to threaten them. They rallied behind Harlan, standing as witnesses, forming a united front. Finally, the day arrived. The sheriff, bolstered by evidence and community support, geared up to confront the criminals once and for all. As they drove toward the men's known hangout, tension thrummed through the air like a tightly pulled bowstring. Harlan sat in the passenger seat, breathing deeply, heart pounding, knowing the battle was approaching a climactic end. When they arrived, the atmosphere was electric, each breath heavy with anticipation. The sheriff stepped out, a palpable authority surrounding him, and Harlan followed behind, pooling his courage to step into the fray alongside the law. The sheriff commanded, his voice cutting sharply through the murky air. The men looked up, shock flashing across their faces as they scrambled to comply, caught off guard, realizing they were no longer the hunters. One of them shouted as panic churned in their eyes. You've terrorized the wrong people, the sheriff declared, pointing at them, words crisp and decisive. Harlan felt a rush of vindication. The battle that had seemed so insurmountable now appeared like a fading shadow, uncertainty dissipating with each passing moment. The leader spat back, shifting into defiance. Not if we have anything to say about it, the sheriff replied, the authority evident in his voice. As the men were taken away, Harlan felt a flood of relief wash over him. All his hard work had paid off. The community had come together, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. The days that followed were filled with a blend of healing and celebration. People turned out in droves to support Harlan and his family, an unbreakable bond forged in the fires of adversity. They gathered in the fields, laughter mingling with the gusts of wind, and Harlan finally felt the weight of fear lessen. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Harlan stood outside, taking in the beauty of his land. The crops swayed gently, alive with the promise of tomorrow. He knew this fight had changed him. No longer just a farmer, he had become a warrior, fighting for all who cared about the land, their homes, and their futures. The scars of battle were real, but they had been replaced by confidence and a deep sense of belonging. As the sky darkened, Harlan felt gratitude swelling within him. This was more than just land. It was a testament to resilience and unity. And no matter what came next, he would stand strong, rooted in the soil he had fought so hard to protect. With a heart full of pride, Harlan took a deep breath, knowing that he had not only reclaimed his home, but also the spirit that would endure against any storm. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt optimistic. What mattered most was not just that he had defended his land, but that he had stood his ground defiantly, unwavering, and fiercely alive. The sun hung low in the sky, bathing the fields in golden hues, when Harlan White first noticed them. 3 figures in dark jackets leaned against a battered pickup truck at the edge of his property, their laughter cutting through the serene sound of rustling corn. Harlan squinted against the fading sunlight, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen enough trouble in his days to know that the unwanted company meant trouble that could change everything. Harlan had poured his sweat and soul into this land for decades. It wasn't just soil and crops. It was where he raised his children, where memories of laughter echoed through the trees, and where love blossomed in every planted seed. But as he stood on his porch, he could sense a storm brewing, not the kind that would drench his crops, but one that threatened to sweep away everything he held dear. He called out, his voice steady but laced with the underlying concern that gripped him. One of the men pushed off the truck and swaggered toward the gate, confidence radiating from him like heat from the pavement. "We're here to talk about your land, Harlan. You may want to consider our offer," he said, a smirk crossing his face as though they were discussing a simple business deal, not an outright threat. "I told you I'm not selling," Harlan replied, the fire igniting within him. "This land is my life. I've seen its trials and triumphs." The man's grin turned predatory, revealing teeth that looked like they could bite. "You really think you can stand against us? We're just being polite here." "What you call politeness, I call a threat," Harlan shot back, frustration bubbling inside him. Silence fell for a beat, thick like fog, before laughter erupted among the men. "You think you're tough? This is not a game for someone like you," the man said dismissively, looking back at his friends. "We'll be back, Harlan." Fear clawed at Harlan's insides as the men climbed into the truck, the engine roaring to life, sending a cloud of dust spiraling into the air. He stood watching as they drove away, anger pulsating through him. They might come back, but so would he, and he wouldn't yield. As dusk settled, he retreated inside, a world of unease swirling around him. Sleep eluded him, shadows dancing in the corners of his mind. Each creak of the house, each whisper of wind against the window, sent his thoughts reeling back to the men and their intentions. He needed a plan, a way to protect what was rightfully his. Days turned into restless nights, filled with relentless vigilance. Harlan installed cameras around his property, monitoring every corner, every inch of land that he had fought so hard to build. He logged each interaction in a notebook, meticulously documenting their threats. The creeping dread transformed into an unwavering determination. Then came the quiet knock one stormy night. Harlan's heart raced as thunder rumbled in the distance. He had just tucked his children into bed, and he was prepared for a small piece of relief after all the chaos. But as he approached the door, something gnawed at him. With cautious resolve, he opened it, revealing the figures of those men from the truck again, shadows transpiring across his porch. Harlan demanded, grounding himself in the familiar haunts of his resolve. "We just want to remind you of what happens to people who stand in our way," the leader said, his voice low and filled with menace. "You think you're safe living out here?" A cold chill clenched around Harlan's heart, but he wouldn't cower. "You'll have to do much better than scare tactics." One man stepped forward, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. The tension hung heavily like a thundercloud ready to burst. Harlan drew a deep breath, every instinct telling him to protect not just the land but also his family's legacy. "If I have to defend this place with my life, I will. So I suggest you leave before things get ugly," he warned, raising a calm hand to show his intent. But the leader just chuckled, stepping back. As they retreated, Harlan slammed the door, the weight of fear and anger crashing over him like a tidal wave. They had crossed a line, and he wouldn't cower in the face of their threats. This was war now. That night he could hardly sleep, glancing at the clock every few seconds, pulse racing with the fear of what might come next. The next morning brought a surge of determination. He would gather allies, people who cared about their own land and livelihoods, and together they would fight against intimidation. He began reaching out to local farmers, sharing stories of what had transpired. To his surprise, he found other victims of the same men, other families who had faced similar threats. There was power in numbers, and Harlan understood that their strength lay in their unity. As the days morphed into a week, the men continued to lurk, their dark truck hovering just beyond the boundaries of his property, as if they were shadows waiting for the right moment to strike. Harlan kept the women and children close, making sure they felt safe, while gathering a small army of supporters ready to take a stand. Then one afternoon, during a community meeting at the local community center, Harlan felt a stir of excitement as he stood up to address the crowd. He shared his story, recounting the uninvited visits, the intimidation, and the defiance that burned in his chest. "If we don't stand together, we'll allow them to pick us off one by one," he urged, eyes glinting with intensity. Cheers of agreement rang out around the room, the resolve palpable. Neighbors nodded, some wiping tears, others softened by the shared struggle. They understood the fight was not just Harlan's, but theirs as well, a battle for all of their futures. Days later, they organized patrols around the area, watching for any sign of the men. Harlan stood vigilant, eyes scanning every inch of the fields, every shadow that crossed his path. The entire community became intertwined in the fabric of his fight. They supported one another, fostering a sense of strength he had never imagined possible. Their unity emboldened Harlan. He felt the old farmer spirit of resilience coursing through him. Memories of laughter and love on his land were not just his, they belonged to everyone, woven into the very essence of the community. One day, while tending to his crops, he noticed a figure in the distance, a familiar truck creeping up his driveway. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter, but this time, he stood tall, heart racing, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of protection. The men stepped out, looking as menacing as ever. "We're back to finish what we started," the leader sneered, but their confidence wavered at the sight of the crowd gathering behind Harlan. "This time, it's not just me you'll have to deal with," Harlan challenged, a rallying spirit rising within him. The men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard by the unity that had blossomed in the community, but their bravado quickly flared back up. "You don't scare us, farmer." "We're not afraid of you," Harlan declared, the crowd echoing his sentiments. As the tension crackled like electricity in the air, Harlan's pulse quickened. He felt a rush of bravery coursing through him, even as he recognized the danger ahead. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." The men hesitated, caught between intimidation and the invisible shield of community surrounding Harlan. But then one of the men laughed, a cruel sound that cracked through the air. "No, but we can call the sheriff," Harlan replied coolly, motioning to a patrol car pulling into his driveway. The unexpected arrival sent a wave of panic through the men. The sheriff shouted, stepping forward with authority, gun drawn. As the men scrambled back to their truck, Harlan felt a swell of victory rising within him. "This is not just my land, but the land of all of us," he shouted, conviction igniting his words like wildfire. "We will not yield." With the men leaving in a flurry of dust and anger, Harlan felt the warmth of solidarity wrap around him. The community had come together and the battle had shifted in his favor. But as days pressed on, something inside him reminded him that this fight wasn't over. The trauma had left scars, but the unity and courage would help them heal. Harlan continued to gather evidence, documenting every interaction as he pushed on toward building a case against the men who threatened his land and family. Weeks turned into months, and the community rallied around Harlan. Their small, determined group gained traction in the fight for justice. Together, they stood firm, unyielding against the shadow of intimidation. They shared their stories, and slowly, the world began to listen. The day arrived when they were ready to take a stand before the courts. The sun cast an unyielding glare on the building, but inside, Harlan felt a cool calm wash over him. It was time to fight back, not just for himself, but for every family threatened by the same darkness. With each voice that rose in support, Harlan felt a connection to those who stood behind him, a tapestry woven from shared struggles, stitched together in resilience. The judge listened intently as they presented their case, their stories interwoven like threads in an enduring fabric. Harlan could feel the weight of the moment, the tidal wave of hope surging through the room. They stood together, united not just as victims, but as pillars of strength against intimidation. Finally, the judge leaned forward, the gavel at the ready, and delivered a verdict. The fear that had once loomed over Harlan and his community began to shrink, like the shadows cast by the sun rising high in the sky. The criminals would be held accountable, but more importantly, the message echoed clear. The community would not be silenced. As they left the courthouse, the sense of victory was palpable. Harlan felt the warmth of his community radiating around him, a strength forged in adversity. For the first time, he understood the true power of unity, how they had transformed fear into resilience and defiance into triumph. Time moved on, but one thing remained unmistakably clear. Harlan would never take his land for granted again. His fight had galvanized a community into action, and he would continue to nurture that bond, ensuring it flourished for generations to come. Standing in the fields as dusk descended once more, Harlan took a moment to breathe it all in. The land, his land, was now a symbol of hope, love, and the unwavering spirit of a community that would never yield, rekindling in him the belief that home is worth fighting for. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a fiery glow over Harlan White's sprawling farmland. It was a picture-perfect scene, fields of golden corn swaying softly in the evening breeze, and the steady rhythm of cicadas filling the air. Yet something felt different that day. There was an unease hanging in the air, thick enough to taste, stirring a sense of dread in Harlan's gut. As he walked toward the barn, the familiar crunch of gravel underfoot was interrupted by an unfamiliar rumble. Harlan paused, glancing toward the road that edged his property. A black pickup truck appeared, its engine growling like a predator. Harlan's heart quickened. He recognized the truck. It had belonged to a group of men who had been sniffing around his land for weeks now, hoping to pry it out of his hands. He felt anger bubbling beneath the surface as the truck rolled up to his yard, tires kicking up dust. 3 men jumped out, clad in dark clothing, their faces set in expressions of arrogance. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, grinning like a wolf poised for the kill. "Even in, Harlan," he called out, his voice dripping with false cheer. Harlan's jaw tight. "I'm not interested in any kind of business with you." The man's grin faltered for just a moment, revealing the teeth beneath, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "You're making a mistake, old man. This land of yours, it's as good as ours." Harlan straightened, fists clenching. "I've fought for this land all my life." The man leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. "You don't want to make this difficult, Harlan. You have a family, don't you?" The air crackled with tension, dread knotting in Harlan's stomach. He could feel the rising danger behind their words, and it ignited a fire inside him. With that, he turned on his heel and marched back toward the safety of the house, leaving the men simmering in disbelief. Inside, he slammed the door, leaning against it as his heart raced. They wouldn't scare him. No one would take his land without a fight. That night, Harlan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as darkness enveloped him. Fear creeped in like a thief in the night, darkening his thoughts. What if they came back? What if they hurt his family? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. He had to do something. The next morning, the sun rose bright and unrelenting. Harlan got up early, brewing coffee in the kitchen as he formulated a plan. He needed to fortify his home, protect his family, but he also needed allies. He had to reach out to his neighbors, gather support, and build a wall of resistance against these criminals. Over the next few days, Harlan went from farm to farm, knocking on doors, sharing his story. He discovered that he wasn't alone. Other farmers spoke of similar encounters, threats made in the dark corners of their fields. "Together, we can fight back," Harlan urged, his voice steady, passionate. "We can't let them take our lands." As word spread, a community began to form. Neighbors gathered for a meeting, exchanging stories under the broad oak tree that had stood sentinel over the fields for generations. Harlan felt hope blossom, a warmth spreading through him as they united under one common goal. One evening, as they strategized, laughter mingled with the outline of twilight. Someone suggested a neighborhood watch, a way to keep an eye out for the men. Harlan felt encouraged. They would be ready. If the men returned, they wouldn't face them alone. But on the following night, as Harlan patrolled his property, keeping watch under the stars that dotted the sky like diamonds, he caught movement at the edge of his cornfield. Shadows shifted, twisting among the rows, and his heart raced. He called, voice firm, gripping the flashlight in his pocket. Silence followed, thick and foreboding. He took a step closer, and just as the beam of his flashlight pierced the darkness, 3 figures burst from the shadows. Harlan's body reacted instinctively. Adrenaline surged as he rushed toward them, determined to protect his family. He bellowed, but the men only laughed, unfazed. "Look what we have here," the leader mocked, stepping forward, his figure illuminated by the beam of light. "Leave now," Harlan warned, raising the flashlight like a weapon. In a swift motion, the men moved to encircle him, and fear took a backseat to raw determination. Harlan felt alive, the fire of protection blazing in his chest. "I won't hesitate to defend my home," he declared, voice steady. But just as the tension reached its peak, a loud crash echoed through the air. Harlan's heart dropped as he turned, realizing a car had barreled down the dirt road, headlights flashing erratically. The sheriff's patrol car skidded to a halt, lights spinning in a dizzying display, and the men hesitated, fear creeping into their bravado. The sheriff yelled, stepping out with his badge shining brightly in the darkness. The criminals momentarily froze, uncertainty flashing across their faces. Harlan felt a surge of relief, but he wasn't done yet. He shouted. The moment hung in the air, taut as a wire. The criminals exchanged a furtive glance, weighing their options. "This isn't over, farmer," the leader muttered, venom lacing his voice. "Then it's a promise I look forward to keeping," Harlan shot back, his words echoing through the night like thunder. As the men retreated, slipping into the shadows from which they'd come, Harlan breathed a sigh of relief. He had defended his home, but he knew the battle was far from over. The following days revolved around vigilance. The sheriff continued to patrol the area more frequently, and with each passing moment, the sense of danger hung over Harlan like a dark cloud. He had taken a stand, but the threat loomed just out of sight, never fully leaving him in peace. But as Harlan gathered strength from the community, something began to shift. Stories of resilience and courage spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once kept their distance now openly discussed their own battles, revealing hidden scars and forgotten fears. Together, they began to take action. Harlan felt a renewed sense of purpose as they organized nightly watch shifts, creating a network of eyes that would keep an ever-watchful eye on the fields and roads. Each car that passed became a signal, each shadow in the distance a potential threat. But in that solemnity, camaraderie blossomed. Yet, as the moon waxed and waned, Harlan's nightmares of the men haunted him. The echo of threats replayed in his mind. Just when relief began to seep into his weary bones, the unsettling rumble of that familiar truck broke the night's peace. Dread enveloped him, heart pounding like a freight train as he peered outside. "Not again," he whispered under his breath. It was a night like any other, quiet and dark, and yet the return of those men felt like a tempest brewing on the horizon. Harlan stepped outside, this time with more stakes than ever. Shadows coalesced around the truck, tightening like a noose. He called out, forcing bravado into his voice. The leader emerged from the darkness, a smirk dancing on his lips. "Get lost," Harlan warned, the weight of his resolve anchoring him. With a sudden motion, the men surged toward him. But Harlan stood his ground, adrenaline coursing through him as he swung the flashlight, cracking it against one man's shoulder. It was a hit of desperation, a cry for defiance. The air filled with chaos, a whirlwind of voices shouting as blows were exchanged. Harlan fought with every ounce of strength, feeling the raw energy fueling him. But just as hope ignited within, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darted toward his house. His heart sank. He shouted, panic surging as he turned to follow, realizing the danger wasn't just for him. From behind, the gang pressed him, arms grabbing and pulling him away. He shouted, but the world spun too quickly, and before he knew it, he was struggling against their strength. But then a blinding light pierced the darkness. Headlights surged toward them, casting shadows back, and Harlan felt a rush of warmth wash over him. The sheriff had arrived, sirens screaming, and the criminals scattered like leaves in the wind. The sheriff commanded, throwing his weight forward. But as the chaos cleared, Harlan felt despair suffocating him. The house no. He pushed through a haze of limbs to break free from their hold, rushing toward the porch. The sight that met his eyes froze him in place. There stood his wife and children, eyes wide with terror as the men lunged toward them. A primal roar erupted from Harlan's throat, charging him forward like a bull, determination renewed. He thundered, fear replaced with rage. Every ounce of love and protection surged within him, and at that moment he became more than a farmer. He was a warrior fighting for everything that mattered. The world around him blurred into chaos as he barreled forward, adrenaline flooding his veins. With a swipe, he found himself in the midst of it all, grappling with the nearest assailant, fists flying, heart pounding like war drums. In that moment of raw vulnerability and strength, Harlan realized they couldn't break him. They might have come in the dead of night, masked under threats of violence, but he had community behind him, and he'd fight until the very end. But just as the air thickened with fury and chaos, it all came crashing down in one heartbeat. A loud crack echoed through the night as Harlan turned to see a figure behind him, a familiar face that sent a wave of ice down his spine. It was the leader of the gang, standing there with a glint of steel in his hand. Terror crept in as he raised a weapon. And in that split second, Harlan's world teetered on the edge of destruction, life and death suspended in a tense embrace. He whipped around, breath caught in his throat, and all at once, the storm of conflict erupted into chaos. The battle was far from over. In the face of his dogged determination, it would either reignite or extinguish completely.